Afternoon, everyone. I'm gonna just talk a little bit about what's happening today and what's coming up next for the History Department workshop as we watch people log in for our session. I'm Emily Mokros. I'm one of the conveners of the History Department workshop this year. This session is going to be moderated and introduced in a few minutes by Amy Malventano, a PhD candidate in the Department of History and also a member of the program committee and convener of the department workshop here at UK. Our session today is a discussion of environmental history led by the Environmental History Working Group, centering on a recent and really interesting book called A Field on Fire, The Future of Environmental History. I just wanted to alert you to what's coming up next week and the week after in the History Department workshop before we get to the subject for today. Next week, October 30th, Friday, October 30th, we're going to have a work in progress session sponsored by the Imperial Encounters Working Group. This is Professor Scott Taylor's paper, Coffee in the Body, From Exoticism to Wellness in 18th Century Europe. And that's going to have comments by Jeremy Popkin. And then the following Friday, November 6th, we're going to have a paper by graduate student Alan Fletcher called Marie R. Turner and the Politics of Education in Breathitt County, Kentucky, and that's gonna have comments by Kathy Newfont. Both of those papers are available and I'll be sending those out. So we have a pretty packed schedule here at the end of October, beginning of November, looking forward towards the end of the semester. But without further ado, I think I'd just like to turn it over to Amy so she can tell us a little bit about the structure of our discussion today, which is a little bit different and a little bit more interactive, and looking forward to it.
Thank you, Emily. So today, like Dr. Mokros says, we are going to offer a panel discussion on A Field on Fire, The Future of Environmental History, which was edited by Mark Hershey and Ted Steinberg in 2019. If you have received our emails, we will have gotten some selections from that book, along with some organizing questions and notes. We're going to offer some comments at the beginning, and then we are going to open it up for some larger discussions of how environmental history kind of fits into our university, into our different research protocols, and just happenings in the field of historical study today. Speakers for today's session include Dr. Kathy Newfont, an associate professor here at the University of Kentucky in the Department of History, as well as the following Environmental History Working Group members, all of whom are graduate students in the History Department, and they include Lincoln Boykin, Rachel Harrington, Emma Kaiser, and myself, Amy Malventano. For now, I'm going to turn it over to Emma Kaiser, who is going to give a kind of an overview of the Environmental History Working Group.
Thanks, Amy. Welcome, everyone. Like Amy said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Environmental History Working Group. The seeds of the working group began growing in the fall of 2018 with a graduate level environmental history course taught by Professor Kathy Newfont. Early the next semester in 2019, the bulk majority of us attended the Dimensions of Political Ecology conference, also known as DOPE. We left DOPE feeling particularly inspired by Dr. Carolyn Finney's keynote address about the intersections of race and environment, as well as the prospect of more historical involvement in environmental issues. Our DOPE debrief sparked interest in creating a working group, and we began meeting regularly. We have continued to meet even during the summers and especially during the pandemic. The members have come to environmental history from different avenues. We bring different perspectives and research interests to the group and have developed a set of tools with which we explore environmental history. The working group has offered many kinds of opportunities and support for professional development, such as quals reading groups, conference and publication preparation, and peer review. The group also offers a space for collegiality and mutual support. This support has been even more crucial during the pandemic. The group is primarily student-led with guidance from Dr. Newfont, and I will now turn that over to her.
People just nod because my mute is a little weird. Yes, now you can. Okay. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. I've been having technical issues with this. So welcome everyone. I'm really delighted to have you here, and I'm so proud of the Environmental History Working Group. As Emily said to open, this is a little different than what we've done before with our series of workshops, because this has multiple participants. It's a book discussion. It has multiple graduate student participants who are really the heart of this program. So I want to thank the Environmental History Working Group for putting this together. And I also want to especially thank Amy Malventano for her great leadership in pulling this all together. Would not have been possible had she not stepped up to the plate. So I have several jobs here. To introduce the book and Donald Worster to you, to those of you who may not be familiar with him or know anything about the book. We circulated some excerpts from the book, but that was not required reading. So some of you may not be familiar with that. Also to introduce the field of environmental history, which is amusing because those of you who did get a chance to read the excerpts may have run across Douglas Weiner's 2005 speech, a death-defying attempt to articulate a coherent definition of environmental history. So I'm supposed to make that death-defying attempt myself. So I'll do that here in a minute. And then I'm also, I want to talk a little bit about our student speakers today and just briefly mention their work. So I'm going to start by introducing this book a bit. Okay, so this is the book Field on Fire, as Amy mentioned, and it's subtitled The Future of Environmental History. And the book does a number of things. It was put together, as Amy also mentioned, by a group of environmental historians, students and colleagues of Donald Worster, who was a leading environmental historian in the field. He was one of the founders of the field. His most famous work probably is the work Dust Bowl, which came out in 1979. It was the second book and it won the Bancroft. It's a hugely influential book in US history and also in environmental history within and beyond North America. So he has a number of other books. His first was Nature's Economy in 1977, Rivers of Empire in 1985, The Wealth of Nature in 1993, and A Passion for Nature, The Life of John Muir in 2008. So those are not all his works, but his major works. So he was clearly an important scholar in environmental history, and he also trained a great number of leading environmental historians today. So he had a long reach as an advisor. He had a long career at the University of Kansas, where he still is. And so the book is a tribute to him by his students and by his colleagues. That's one of its jobs. But as the subtitle suggests, The Future of Environmental History, it also is designed as a sort of a state of the field type of book that is giving us, is a tribute to Worster and also tries to look forward to where this field on fire, as they call it, aptly in my view, where it's going. So that's Worster briefly. And in terms of my death-defying attempt to define environmental history, let me open. Those of you who had a chance to read the pre-circulated materials have read this paragraph already, but I'm in the piece, the afterword, called The Distinctiveness of Environmental History by Daniel T. Rogers. And I'm just going to read part of a paragraph that he has there where he tries to it makes his death-defying attempt to define a coherent version of environmental history. So he says, like all living fields of history, environmental history exists in constant motion, open at every pore to new ideas, emphases, and contentions. But if we look at the career of one of its grandmasters, Donald Worcester, as emblematic, we might pull out 4 aspects for emphasis. Environmental, and here are his 4. Environmental history pays terrifically close attention to ideas, to the scientific, the aspirational, the mythic, and the conceptual efforts to catch the natural world out there with the approximations of the words and images within human heads. Ideas. Environmental history is secondly a history of power, an inquiry into the systems of social, economic, and political forces through which societies have tried to bring nature under their command, to sustain it, to wring human utility from it, and in modern times reshape every piece of it from its simplest genomes to its great seas and atmosphere. Okay, so second, power. Third, environmental history plays across an immense range of scales, more so than any other history I know. By that, he means that, as he discusses later in the piece, that it's important to be very, very local in some versions of environmental history, because you have to get at the ecological complexity of a particular area. For me as an Appalachian historian, working in one of the most ecologically complex sections of the globe, it's really important to pay very close attention to local situations and the complexity of those situations. On the other hand, the scale goes all the way up to the regional. Environments don't respect boundaries, but political boundaries matter to environmental history. So from the regional to the national to the global, there's a robust global environmental history as well. For instance, around climate, it would be one example. So, so the way it plays across scale is his third point. And finally, he says, environmental history is a moral endeavor. It compels our attention to the ethical seriousness that runs so hard through it. And then he goes, except insofar as it incorporates some combination of these themes, styles of inquiry, and moral passion, it would be no more special than any of the other histories blossoming around it. All right, so so that it's a moral endeavor. It has its roots in advocacy, as so many of the other growing fields do, social justice advocacy in fields such as histories of race and histories of gender. And it also, so it has those 4 components that were offered there. To those, I would like to add 2 in my death-defying attempt. I would add, first of all, that environmental history has an interdisciplinary bent. Mark Hersey mentions this in his introduction. He calls it an inherently interdisciplinary field. And I think that that's important to note as we think about environmental history in our own work and at our, as Amy said, in our department at our university, and the way that environmental history at UK can play at these many scales, which I think it actually can in our department at our university, beyond our university in the US and beyond the US in the world. The second point that I would like to add is that environmental history takes the material world of organisms, weather, soil, and so on very seriously. This is implied in some of the points earlier, but I want to articulate it that these human action does not go on independent of all that. And this makes for some troubling intersections between environmental history and post-structural theory, as we hear a bit about from Mark Hersey in his introduction, because of the preeminence really of ideas in post-structural thinking and language and so on, whereas with environment, it really matters that there are microbes. I guess it matters to all of our lives right now, doesn't it? It really matters that there are microbes. We would be gathered around in person if there were not microbes, right? But we'd also all be dead if there were not microbes. So, but it matters that the fact of microbes existing outside human ideas and human control, that matters to environmental historians. So I would add those 2 points. Then I'd like to just, in terms of my own, what I'd like to introduce you to in terms of the state of the field for us, I'm going to share my screen here before I introduce our participants. I want to just give you a sense. Let's see if I can do this. Hopefully this will work. if you'll nod, if you can see this, this PowerPoint. Can we see this? Does it work? Yeah, okay. All right, thank you. So I want to go back to the beginning. Okay, so this is from a feature done by the American Historical Association in 2015. As you can see, Robert Townsend, the rise and decline of history specializations in the last 40 years. And I think this is a 5-year-old article, but I think it has real resonance for us as a history department. So first of all, the field with the largest proportional expansion in this time period, they traced 40 years of history from 1975 to 2015. This is their, what's going on in terms of specialties. And the largest proportional expansion within the topic areas. Obviously, we've seen a decline in European history and a rise in Asian history, for instance, in terms of its the number of practitioners who do that work. This is in U.S. departments, the American Historical Association. So the field with the largest proportional expansion was environmental history, which went from 0.2% of the faculty in 1975. So that's when Worcester's career was getting started. He was part of that 0.2%, to 2.7% in 2015. And as this article says, that may still seem like a small number, but the share of departments employing an environmental historian grew to 43% in 2015, which is, immense growth, right? So that we are among the 43% here at UK that has an environmental historian. Next, I'd like to point your attention to this graph, and I'm looking at specifically at this pink line here. You see the pink line toward the bottom? That's environmental history. It starts out near 0. You cannot see the pink line? Okay, why is that? Is it too low in the screen?
Is the screen share frozen?
Slide.
Oh, it's not on the slide. All right, let me go back. Are you on the rise and decline?
Yeah.
Okay, and then if I go forward, I'm seeing the topic areas in which the share of history specialists increase, but you are not seeing that?
I think you might need to unshare and then reshare again. It freezes sometimes, I think.
Okay, all right, I'll do that. Sorry about that. That's a technical issue, obviously. Okay, let me screen share again. Go from here. Okay. Is it there now?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'm trying to direct your attention to the pink line at the bottom of this graph, which is the environmental history line. And you can see that in 1975, it starts out near 0. And then as we go to 2015, it's up here approaching 3%. So it's still very low by 2015, but its growth curve is significant. And if you watch what it's doing, it looks like it's poised to grow exponentially as of 2015, which has to do with, which is happening, that the field on fire. Environmental history is indeed growing at quite a brisk pace. All right, so hopefully this will work when I show you. I have just a couple more slides and then I'll do introductions of the students and turn it over. So for us, what I think is particularly interesting is how significant growth occurred in other topic areas where we have working groups, including race and gender. And these, the article identified as fields on long trajectories of growth in the discipline. So women and gender, that was a truly exponential growth curve in this time period between 1975 and 2015. It grew by nearly 800%. Race and ethnicity, one of the arenas that we are building such wonderful strength in, that grew also, was up 220%. So again, huge growth in that area over this 40-year period. There's also information relevant to our practices in working history groups. So public history, which we're turning kind of more robust attention to in recent years, had the fastest growth of any field that was already in the 1975 guide. Some fields didn't show up in the 1975 guide and have since sort of taken off. And then also relevant for our department, the relatively new field of digital history was represented only 5.6% of listed departments as of 2015. Now, 5 years have gone by and digital history also is growing exponentially, but I think that's important for us to note too, as we have Dr. Fiery, of course, and Dr. Stephen Davis as well, both very active digital historians. And we've heard already from Amy Malventano and Emma Kaiser, both of whom have interest in digital environmental history. So, for me, this is very interesting for our department if we look at all this together, because I'm going to go back here, go down to this, you're seeing this graph again, I hope? Yes, we are seeing the graph. Okay, thank you. So if you go down and look at the pink field of environmental history, right beside it is the green, there's a green line right beside it, that's public history. And the purple line right beside it is race and ethnicity. And I see these things as they're almost braided together in this graph. And I think we have real opportunities at the University of Kentucky to braid them together even further. And I see this as a potential area of leadership for us. And I hope we'll hear from some of our, well, I know we'll hear from some of our students about those issues. Okay, so I'm going to stop screen sharing and I'm going to hush up in just a minute. But as I look at Field on Fire, I'm struck by a couple of things. One is that the field is very dynamic. It's explosive. It's going in many, many directions, some of which are captured here. So I'm struck by that, the dynamism of the field, the innovations that are going on, the ways that this book captures a great deal of that. And I am also struck by what's not in the book. Like, to me, if I were writing a future of environmental history book, it would look very different from this book. And in fact, the book hardly touches on some of the arenas of environmental history that I find most exciting. Our department is doing a better job with that, in my view, of hitting on some of these arenas that I find most exciting. And so, and with that said, I want to turn it over to my colleagues. So I'm going to talk about the students who are about to present, but I also want to talk about some other students who are not presenting, but whose work is part of the vibrancy of environmental history here at the University of Kentucky. So Emma Kaiser, whom you already met, has done an environmental history of Blanton Forest as her MA project. And so, and looking at the efforts to protect this very rare old growth tract. This is innovative work that is, as far as I know, the first history of an old growth forest, like deliberate history, environmental history of an old growth, a protected old growth forest in the United States. We're also going to hear from Rachel Harrington. Her MA project was on commons enclosure refugees, a term that she created. This is her new, one of her intellectual contributions, is this idea of commons enclosure refugees, which I think is a really important concept. And she traced these refugees that were created by clearances on the north and southwest, in north and southwest, which is over in the British Isles. We're up in northern Scotland. So Rachel's coming at this from beyond the United States. Then we hear Lincoln is going to be speaking as well, and he's got Lincoln Boykin's got this wonderful project on his MA project is on. It traces the ties between white supremacy and hunting regulations in the Deep South at the turn of the 20th century. And he's finding evidence that these two things are entwined, and he's joining a growing body of literature that suggests that that in fact environmental regulations such as hunting regulations was a pillar of the Jim Crow system that has not been properly examined yet or understood for its power. Black hunters in the Deep South were locked out. And this is interesting to me as a common scholar because there's a lot of resonance with that in the post-Reconstruction era where Black Southerners were increasingly locked out of livestock commons as well, and a variety of other spaces. Okay, so we hear from Lincoln Boykin after we hear from Rachel. Then I want to talk, you've met Amy, but I want to talk about her doctoral project which is on Louisville Club women and their work on behalf of environmental preservation in the first half of the 20th century. So Amy has a gendered analysis, is looking at women's activism here in Kentucky in the early decades of the 20th century. Chris Lettingham couldn't be with us today because his work with the Kentucky Historical Society has got him elsewhere. But he's launching a doctoral project focused on Kentucky in the late 18th century, and he's answering what is a oft-repeated call from environmental historians for more and better work on the early United States. So Chris is part of the community there too. Stuart Sims couldn't be with us because of a family situation he's navigating. He's completing an MA thesis on the environmental history of the Stennis Space Center in Hancock, Mississippi, including the dispossessions of rural families. So this is part of NASA history that has not been told. Jillian McCommons, whom I'm delighted to see is here with us, and she's not in Lexington with us right now because she's on fellowship in Virginia. But her work on the Black Appalachian Commission led her to environmental history and environmental justice issues, including her recent piece on the Sanctified Hill community in Eastern Kentucky. And her piece is in Black perspectives, and she talks about Black ecologies and Appalachian hillsides as Black ecologies. So Jillian, actually, if you get a chance to put the link in the chat, that would be great. This is a wonderful piece that I've assigned in my one of my environmental history courses I've got going on right now, and demonstrates, again, the ways that we are innovating here at the University of Kentucky. Abby Stevens has an MA project in progress that traces the way Kentucky public health officials near the turn of the 20th century work to prevent and control epidemic disease. Thank you, Jillian. I see that is there. Thank you so much. So epidemic disease near the turn of the 20th century as they're inventing the public health system in response, of course, to microbes. Then we've got Cameron Boutin, whose doctoral project focuses on the ways weather influenced the lives of Civil War soldiers, perhaps even more than battle did. And Jacob Wood, who has considered the intersections of politics and environment and wrote a qualifying exam field on environmental history focused on climate and empire. Then other students who are here, Jay Ball has done some oral history work that is connected to environment in important ways. CJ Working has done some thinking on environment in the early 19th century. And so we have a lot of environmental expertise in the room with us. So for me, I see the University of Kentucky as poised to make contributions beyond the contributions of this book. I see us taking environmental history in directions in some ways very different from what the Worcester crew is doing. So I will hush now and turn it over to our first speaker, which is Rachel.
Rachel, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. I would also like to thank the organizers for their invitation to our group today, all of the attendees, and of course, my environmental history working group colleagues for their contributions. Firstly, I want to share with you two main takeaways from A Field on Fire, followed by my two main critiques of the work. Donald Worcester has maintained that due to the human-environment relationship inherent in environmental history, every academic discipline must or can be viewed through an environmental lens, and that every academic discipline fits under the environmental history umbrella. And this is crucial. This is a crucial point, which Kathy already mentioned, for the field. My second takeaway comes out of part one, which highlights the importance Worcester places on facing the ecological limits in the Anthropocene era. The authors in this section show how the history of environmental limitations matter. They point out that Worcester reminds historians not to ignore environmental ecological limits. They also state that American environmental historians have previously refused to accept those limits, and their blatant refusal has often led to ecological catastrophes. The failure to acknowledge environmental limits in the past reveals much about present structures, inequalities, and cultural influences of communities and regions, which I found interesting and applicable. These are important observations which apply to many academic disciplines and subfields in the study of history. My first critique comes from really that although there are several non-American contributors to the work, it is Western focused and particularly US centric. This is due to Donald Worster's role, of course, as a key founder of American environmentalism and environmental history. However, by doing this, the authors seem to frame environmental history as a US field only, while ignoring the fact that global environmental history is very robust. Maybe the future of American environmental history would have been a better subtitle. The flip side is that Worster has had a long reach and influence on global environmentalism, and these are not considered in the work, which is unfortunate. My second critique is that a global perspective would be helpful to show how other regions have reacted to Worster's contribution or contributions. Africa, Europe, and the Southern Hemisphere have developed their own environmental histories. It would assist readers to compare these alongside Worster's ideas. Perhaps it is time for a second edition, which will address the historical roots of global fires, the pandemic, the current pandemic, globalization, the environmental catalysts that cause such contemporary human environmental events, such as migration, forest depletion, and war. In my own work, I try to address the effects of the enclosure of common lands and resources and the consequences that arose from enclosing commons in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Commons enclosure affects marginalized and indigenous communities globally, and this is there is a direct connection to Worster's human environment nexus concept raised in A Field on Fire. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Lincoln Boykin.
All right, thank you, Rachel. And thank the Environmental History Working Group and the organizers for inviting me here as well. So I'd like to give you sort of a big overview first of A Field on Fire, and then also sort of takeaways that I had that I thought were important, and also a couple of critiques as well. So A Field on Fire, as I see it, it celebrates the work of Donald Worster and really uses the concepts and frameworks that Worster pioneered to demonstrate that there's a vibrant historiography in the field of environmental history. I particularly like the phrase that environmental history is a big tent. And A Field on Fire, I think, represents this analogy quite well. From the radical origins of environmental history out of the anti-Vietnam War movement to debates on capitalism, to talking about the Anthropocene, to hunting and wilderness, to science, there's quite a bit of ground that is covered in this volume. But underpinning the whole work, though, is a laudatory nature of Worster's work. And sort of in the subtitle of the work, A Field on Fire, and the essays contained within are billed as the future of environmental history. So one thing that really pleased me about reading the book is the comparative histories that it offers. The environment, as we all know, does not exist in a vacuum. And these essays help to remind Americanists like myself, particularly doing American history, that there is value in our work not only in America but across the globe, and also there is value in work being done across the globe here in America. I see a particularly generous overlap between transnational issues of hunting, wilderness, and identity, as demonstrated by Saiku, and I've conducted research here at UK that sort of confirms these things. That's nice. Zelko and Russell's calls for historians to step outside of the world of history and engage with scientists, ecologists, and conservation biologists is also a welcome call to hear. And Alfred Crosby made much of a similar call 50 years ago in the Columbian Exchange. And I think that A Field on Fire successfully demonstrates that the field of environmental history is vibrant, expansive, and inclusive. However, A Field on Fire, like most works of history, as we know, is not without issues. One of the most pressing environmental issues facing our generation and also moving forward is land use and agriculture. An essay on agriculture is not present in the book. It's mentioned, but not specifically addressed, which is particularly surprising given Hersey's scholarly predilections. Land use is also mentioned, but not specifically addressed. Partially to Kathy's point, Dr. Newfont has spoken, another important related issue to land use is also local epistemology of communities, experiential knowledge of how local people interact with the environment. That's some of the most important data that an environmental history could have, yet this book doesn't necessarily engage in a serious way or consider that in essays. To me, perhaps one of the biggest oversights of this book is race. It's impossible to address any aspect of American society, which many of these essays do address American society, without the consideration of race. Environmental racism is not a recent creation. Environmental racism has been studied for decades. It has a considerable historiography. Given the societal reckoning with racial justice happening at the moment, it's my belief that environmental racism must be considered a pressing area of engagement in the field of environmental history moving forward. Yet no one essay tackles environmental racism head on. In my own work, I try to address this issue. There have been many environmental histories that have addressed the conservation movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. However, few address sort of blatant examples of environmental racism and white supremacy. The conservation movement, and to a certain extent the environmental movement, were built on structural racism, i.e. white supremacy, and also complicate the narrative of progress that we see that is often told. It's here in my research, and I hope I'm demonstrating with my hunting regulations and commons enclosure to kind of redefine a periodization of environmental racism that it's much earlier than in common use. And environmental racism, I think there is a lot of scholarly ground here for historians to walk it. A Field on Fire is a good point of entree, I think, for those looking to understand the field of environmental history. However, it should not be considered a magnus opus of the field. No book can achieve that. I'm very reluctant, however, to say that this book represents the future of environmental history as well. As we have mentioned with Rachel and Dr. Newfont, I think that we are doing some innovative and very important work here at UK. And I think I do agree with the assertion. I think that we are moving the field further than A Field on Fire currently is. So with that, that's the end of my critique.
Okay, I'm going to pick up and offer my critiques on The Field on Fire and my comments on it. As many of my peers have previously touched upon, through the works organization, it does a good job of highlighting how the study of environment is often tied to capitalism and globalism or the matter of border histories. It also does a good job of showing how environmental historians are using a different array of sources and a different array of approaches. I'm very happy to see that there was articles about GS mapping and also about the use of photography. However, if you take a step back and you think of Donald Worster's idea of ecological history, that environmental history deals with roles and places of nature in human life and has three main levels. Natural history are environments of the past, modes of production, and ideas are ideologies of perception and values. I question why gender is largely left out of the work. Although Worster did not use gender as a tool for his own analysis and his research, in the last 30 plus years, gender has become an important tool or lens for understanding many aspects of environmental history. And in many ways, this can be contributed to Carol Merchant and some of her writings, but especially her call for a more gendered approach to environment. In my own research, I use gender to explore how urban environments have changed over time, particularly through the works of women's organizations and associations in regards to conservation and preservation. Looking at the field, you see activism and patterns of change tied both to gender. Additionally, you see, as a whole, a lot more women starting to write and make contributions in the field of environmental history. But when you look at A Field on Fire, that is not largely coming through. It is not coming through the anthology's content. And then while there are female contributors to the anthology, there are largely not there are more largely white males, and they don't represent strides that have been made both in terms of different ways to different races and ethnicities that are exploring and writing from different perspectives. And I think Emma Kaiser has some other comments that are tied to these same points.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Amy's comments. When Worster proposed the three methodological structures for using the environment as a historical lens in 1990, historian Carolyn Merchant, as Amy already referred to, she responded by arguing for the need of adding a gender perspective to each of the categories, as well as adding reproduction as the fourth category. And in 2012, historian Nancy Unger answered by publishing Beyond Nature's Keepers, which is an environmental history focusing on American women's relationship with the environment, using gender as a framework. So for Field on Fire to continue to have blind spots on gender and women raises the question, is environmental history ignoring Carolyn Merchant? So that's my addition. We've offered our takes on the material in our version of the field, and we're interested in the future of the field at University of Kentucky, and would like to bring you all into the discussion. How do you see environmental history fitting in with your own work?
We welcome you to either raise your hand or type in the chat if you want to make a comment, and we will call on you as we see hands or comments come into the chat. Jay, do you want to unmute yourself? And
yes, thank you, and thanks for this workshop and the fascinating reading and the great takes. I'd like to ask about the passage involving Carl Becker's quotation and Worster's. I guess the question that I have is, as the field continues to expand and mature, are there dangers in, are there growing pains? Are there dangers about it becoming so professionalized that it becomes disconnected from, I don't know, some of the other values that both Becker and Worcester talk about? That is accessibility, the ability to produce scholarship, general readership that can, circulate and do work, I think is the term that he uses, socially and politically. And I say this in part being a refugee from a theory-saturated field like literature and performance studies, where the scholarship, you would just never find it in an airport bookstore or Barnes and Noble. I mean, it's just basically entirely written for specialists. And I'm not hostile to theory, but it does seem to me that that in the current climate of the humanities, that over theorization or theory saturation might sort of come part and parcel with professionalization and legitimation. But I'm just wondering, maybe this isn't a concern at all, but it was raised in the introduction, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are about this. Thank you.
Dr. Newfont, do you want to maybe begin answering that question as maybe the most senior environmental scholar at the University of Kentucky?
Well, sure, I can tackle that. I think it is a concern, Jay. I mean, I think over theorization as the field grows and matures is a potential problem, and moving away. And I know of people who within the field who feel like they have lost the battle to keep it. Well, Dust Bowl was widely read by well beyond the academy, and so I think that it is a concern. And for me, one of the things that's interesting to think about is here at the University of Kentucky, I think we have the opportunity to help counteract that because of our strengths in public history and in oral history. I think that we can, those, and digital history as well, right? Like all of these components that we're have a long history in, for instance, in oral history, and that we're currently building with greater strength in public history and in digital history. It seems to me that those are ways, if we can bring environmental history together with some of those, that could help counteract the sort of movement away from accessible history that you're talking about.
Thank you.
I'd like to share a response to the question and then maybe ask a question that's directed at the student panelists, because I think that hearing each of your projects has been really exciting, and I think you all have a little bit distinct perspectives on where your niche is, and so I'd like to hear you respond to this. So I was telling Amy right before this talk, I went to a talk about environmental history in East Asia, and it was 2 books about forest management in very different contexts, one in early modern China and one in imperial Japan, so focusing on Japan's presence in Korea. And these both taught me quite a bit. My interest had come as a historian of the state primarily, but as we all know, the state is very closely imbricated with what the environment, how the environment is regulated, how people are allowed to make connections with the environment, what types of arbitrary breaks are imposed. And these historians, when they were talking about the history of forests in East Asia, talked about the blunt picture and the fine picture in the context of environmental history, especially it being such a relatively young field. And they said, the first image that we've got talking about forests in East Asia is the famous phrase called the retreat of the elephants, deforestation, the elimination of forests and the retreat of megafauna, tigers and things that used to be in East Asia. But then the refined view is the fact that we still need timber in human history. And so there's planting that happens, and that happens in this imperial Japan context of the 20th century, as well as in the long-term context. And so we've started to think about, it's not deforestation, but afforestation, or changing the forests and what they look like. And so if I think about my work, I think about the presence of the state and the amount of paper that they need to produce the things that I'm interested in. And I immediately start thinking about the forests, and that makes me in some ways an environmental historian, or maybe a lazy environmental historian, because I don't have quite the tools to figure out where my environment connects to my sources. And so I was interested to hear the students talk about, you know, when you started your projects, you know, what is the blunt view that you might have had or that was being presented, and how are you seeing a more refined view as you kind of work directly with new types of sources or different approaches?
I guess I can start kind of getting into my project, especially kind of as I started exploring the sources for women, the women's organization there in Louisville. One thing that really stood out was that it was environmental history on so many different levels. It was the environmental history of kind of urban environmentalization, of how had the environment changed or was changing, and how was this group helping. But then there's also the story of how this organization is working to make contributions to clean up a city, and there's political aspects of it, and then there's also public health in there. And so there's so many different avenues, and I have basically started seeing that the records are showing that environment is linked to so many different aspects of just human life and of nature. That's one of my takeaways from working with my sources and some of the stuff I'm finding. Does Rachel, Emma, or Lincoln, do y'all have any other perspectives?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Dr. Montrose. A lot of what you hit on about sort of like your personal relationship with being an environmental historian reminds me of some of the books that I've been reading lately, but just to personally how my blunt view has changed, especially since forests are my main interest. I can respond pretty easily. I mean, but it's still complicated. So I guess, well, coming into the field, I was interested in forest history because I love being in forests, and then discovering that they're mostly forests that have grown up after a tide changing industrial cutting era has been pretty mind-blowing for me. And then learning more about the challenge, the pros and cons of state managed environment, or like the state, as you're talking about, the state managed forests. Thank goodness the state stepped in to save the forests, but at the same time, the way that they're managed really matters, and especially the history really matters of how the federal government acquired these lands and dispossessed people. But I'm also learning more about, you mentioned afforestation and reforestation and deforestation, and then I recently heard about proforestation and being more proactive and using old growth forests, which is a new, I already found them to be significant because of the clear cutting, but even more significantly is that they can be used as models, and they can, for regrowing forests, and in a way that they could actually store more carbon, and could be models for a new type of forestry. At the same time, we don't want to sever or, you know, separate humans from nature even more, or from their forests. And so that, yeah, there's a lot of complexity there, and I'm sure someone else could speak to it too. So thanks for asking.
I could maybe try to add to a little bit from a wildlife perspective, Emma, to kind of piggyback, and also your question, Dr. Makros. It's always an interesting question in environmental history, I think, with resource use and conservation, right? We know that humans have to use resources to survive to a certain extent, but the question is, you know, to what and to who gets to use them, right? That sort of gets at the power angle with it. And sort of the way that I found in my research is with this issue of hunting, right? So in the Deep South, post-Civil War, hunting is used as this tool by elites. There's a transcontinental perspective, right? So they can implement this idea of fair chase. And this idea of fair chase and sporting behavior is then turned into game law. Well, guess what? In the Deep South, in order to promote fair chase into game law, you have to be white. So Black hunters are essentially alienated from the land. They are not allowed to hunt based on hunting regulations, when you could make the remark, and I think it can be, that hunting is sort of a basic, almost a human right, to be able to procure food for yourself and of course for your family. But of course, this resource is not seen this way. And sort of laws and regs that are promoted under the guise of conservation, right? It's going to help wildlife populations. Of course, it's propagandized into, well, African-American hunters are the issue, right? They're killing too much of the game. They don't abide by these laws. And then campaigns to support conservation are, of course, predicated on this idea of white supremacy. None of which is true, but this is just sort of the ideas that you're getting at here with this. So it comes down to, I think, with power and resource use and sort of human sustainability, right? I think it's a word that we would probably use today.
I'll just add briefly, Jillian, I see your hand is up, so I'm just going to add briefly to what my colleagues have said. I did not know that I was an environmental historian. I knew that my work was about land use and about enclosure of common lands, but I wasn't thinking that I would be like, I would go to a conference, an environmental history conference with my work. I wasn't thinking, and that I think is what we're trying to sort of highlight for people and scholars to look at their work and re-examine, you know, how it is that your work is being influenced by the environment. What this kind of, in air quotes, what is nature, what is environment, land use and enclosure of common lands and people migrating because of that is all environmental history. But to me, when I first, you know, embarked on my research, I wasn't thinking of it through that lens. So yeah, thanks for your question.
Hi, I was going to say first that it's kind of connected to what Rachel just said, but my interest in environmental history, I have to attribute a lot of that to Dr. Newfont and being in her Appalachian history class, but also just being in proximity to her work. I don't think it's a coincidence that so many of us in the history department are thinking about environmental history. Her presence kind of enacts that. But I wanted to say, I haven't read this book, Field of Fire, on Fire, so I don't know if they get at this, but I kind of feel like the future of environmental history is hopefully a reckoning with its past. A lot of times environmental histories will start with when Europeans entered a space, and and Indigenous people are kind of just like the first chapter of they were there, they were killed, that's terrible. And then it moves into this kind of European outlook. And we never hear from Indigenous people again, even though many are still here and still interacting with the land and have a worldview that's different, that's generative, that's, and I don't want to romanticize it because I think it's important to listen to Indigenous scholars who push back at that kind of thing too. But I think the literature sometimes, it leaves those communities behind. And then we have these categories like race and ethnicity, where everyone non-white gets dumped in that. When even if you're talking about environmental history, you're always talking about race because you're talking about white people getting access, Indigenous people not. I mean, so it's always there. So I was just wondering if the book touches on that at all about Indigenous people, because I know in my work, I'm trying to always remain conscious of that and how when I'm writing, just to make sure that I'm not disappearing them again in my scholarship by just acting like, you know, they weren't there or that they aren't here. So that's my question.
It's been a while since I've read the book a few months back, but I do not recall, and I guess many of the any other panelists can jump in, but I don't recall very much mention, if any, of Indigenous people at all in the book. I think that was another one of its weaknesses.
Yeah, with that. And I think, Jillian, your point is this is why I don't actually think that the future of environmental history is in this book. I mean, some pieces of it are there, but I actually think that the environmental history of the future it has to reckon with the way that environmental history in the past has been written, and this, partly it's both the strength and a weakness of the field that it grew out of the environmental movement. The environmental movement was, tainted with the same kind of white supremacy that Lincoln is studying in the earlier conservation movement. And the environmental justice movement came about partly because the so-called environmental movement was ignoring issues of justice, and particularly marginalized communities. Black communities, Indigenous communities were bearing the heaviest environmental burdens, and the environmental movement was just sort of ignoring that and was focusing, as Jillian has said, on securing access for white people to certain resources. So for me, like, for instance, I taught this, my Backwater Blues. This is an amazing book, and to me, like a lot of the future of environmental history, this is kind of book is pointing the way. This is the first history of the 1927 Mississippi flood that actually tried to get at the African American experience of that flood and its importance in Black memory and so on, and had to be very innovative with sources in order to do that, and rewrote the history of the flood in such a way that one could not possibly write the history the way it had been written prior to this book. And I think that Jillian's point about looking at Indigenous scholarship, making sure that these, I mean, frankly, it's kind of a project of decolonizing environmental history, really, is what needs to happen. That is what's not going on here, that various of our panelists' comments have been pointing toward. And what, that's part of what DOPE does here at the University of Kentucky every year. It's an effort to, it's coming out of that, decolonization model and perspective. And that again is another source of strength for us here at UK.
Hold on, sorry. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't cutting off anybody. I just wanted to say I am a geographer. I work a lot with DOPE and help run it. So it's great to hear, like historians are into DOPE. My undergrad degree was also in history. So was a focus in environmental history. So it's kind of nice to get back into this. I was curious though, especially seeing that, you all are interested, or most of you are interested in DOPE, about the role that you kind of see like the social sciences playing in this, and how like the connections and overlap between the social sciences and environmental history, because obviously there's like a methodological overlap to a certain extent, but then kind of the ways in which the history part gets consigned to history and isn't fully brought into policy work or into like these contemporary understandings of society. So like how we can kind of build these bridges so that, we're not either duplicating efforts or, we're like finding ways to kind of like raise each other up through these shared interests.
Rachel, did you want to take that answer?
I just wanted to respond briefly to that question. Yes, I agree. I think that's the beauty of environmental history, is that it is able to do that. It's interdisciplinary, and we certainly rely on other disciplines to inform our work. I've used Rob Nixon's The Environmentalism of the Poor, who is a social scientist, in my own work, and that work greatly influenced what I'm doing. I even started looking at interspersal violence in history, and through these clearances, and what these marginalized communities have gone through due to shifting land use, and how it's been there's been this reasoning, this in later history, it's been reasoned away, as progress, basically, or improvement. And certainly I think that we can all work together, and that is the beauty of environmental history, is that it is interdisciplinary.
And I can add a little bit to that if that's all right. I think that oral history interviews, there's a lot of synergy between social scientists' work and historians who do oral histories. I've pulled a lot of information or narrative from ethnography, anthropological work, and folklore, and these have all been really important for getting at the local knowledge of environments and local experiences with environments, and also indigenous knowledge as well. So I agree, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I'll comment on this, and then we'll get Mel's question. I have found that it's almost impossible in many ways to do environmental history without looking to the other without looking to both the social science disciplines, and now, as I'm finding in my dissertation research, without even looking to some of the core science disciplines, especially when you start finding environmental issues are starting to be tied to health issues, and you kind of have to look at both. But I also think that as environmental historians start using digital tools and digital mapping to start doing that, you find yourself working with an array of social sciences to understand the data. So Mel, I'm gonna, unless anybody else has something to say to that question, Jillian, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add that geography was my outside field, and I'm working with theories of Black ecologies and Black geographies, because geographers love theory, and I do too, and historians are often allergic to it. So I just like to say that sometimes it gets in through the theory if historians are using it. And I think it's exciting to like communicate with other disciplines in that way.
And Abby?
I'm kind of on the border of environmental history. I'm more of a medical historian, but I also definitely use sociology, epidemiology, biology. I think you really can't do this kind of work, like Amy said, without engaging with social sciences and natural sciences in a lot of ways.
Any other comments or reactions to Jack's question? Okay, Mel, I'm going to give you the floor.
Sure, thanks. This whole conversation has been really fascinating. And to go back to the very first question you posed about how it relates to our work, I've been sitting here, that's been turning in the back of my mind. And I feel like I have a billion thoughts, so I'm going to try and organize them. As the only kind of, I think, pre-modernist here, although Rachel's kind of on the border there a bit, thinking about the ways that kind of how medieval history has for a long time been talking about the environment without talking about the environment. Thinking about, you know, when I, you know, in some of my earliest medieval history classes, taking, you know, reading about feudalism and the manorial system and how, you know, the development of the 3-crop rotation, right? Things that I have only, I think, since, you know, getting to know environmental historians thought about in environmental terms. And there's, so I have a lot of kind of thoughts about that, about just ideas about what the wilderness was. I think Lincoln and I have chatted occasionally that, you know, the kind of alienation from the land that Lincoln was talking about. There's all kinds of laws in the Middle Ages, like the forest is owned by the king and you can't hunt there. And so even if you're starving, right, like you can't make use of, you know, what would belong to everyone theoretically in maybe some way. And perhaps my question is, for those of us in pre-modern fields which have already a lot of interdisciplinarity, what advice would you give thinking about how environmental history overlaps, intersects with material culture, archaeology, and animal studies, I guess? Those are kind of 3 things that are happening in medieval studies, and there is environmental history within medieval studies, but it's still, I think, it's not as welcomed or not as widespread as in American history, I guess I'll say.
Does anybody on the panel want to take that question? I have some thoughts that I can offer as well that I can say. I guess I can start. I kind of got from how I started into the environmental history field was actually from public history. So when you're talking about animals and a lot of the early part of it, I think we have to think in many ways of how maybe public historians have been doing some of the environmental history work when they're preserving and they're doing museum displays, some of their own research. So I think this really calls to the fact, the hybridity in the discipline. And I think it's something that maybe from my perspective is not really called environmental history, but sometimes gets left out, especially when you're talking about anthropology, and you're getting into archaeological digs and stuff like that, because there's so much of that general knowledge that you have to have, both of history, both of the environment, and everything to do it. And I think that's where, when earlier on Dr. Newfont was talking about public history being such a fast growing field, and I think that is one reason why, and why there are so many ties to the connections between public history and environmental history. Dr. Newfont, did you want to comment or say anything to that regard?
I think you're muted, Dr. Newfont.
Yeah.
Yeah, my computer is very slow to unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
All right, thank you. So first of all, I would say, Mel, that your point about how medievalists have been paying attention to environment without calling it environmental history, I actually think that's a really important point, and I don't want you to go blitzing past that too fast, because in U.S. environmental history, for instance, the historians of the U.S. South were paying very close attention to environment for a long time without calling it that. And then there was this idea that the South was, behind in getting on board environmental history, when in fact, in a lot of ways, the reverse was true. The Western historians were a little, which is where environmental history was centered, were a little slow coming to realize how early scholarship in the South was very, like the Southern historiography, for instance, is far stronger on commons than the Western historiography, which is only now beginning to catch up. And similarly, the U.S. environmental history was framed around Western concepts of aridity, where you're in these arid landscapes out west. Well, in the South, you have like the precise opposite situation where it's very water heavy and water abundant. And so that makes it for a completely different historiography. So one thing I would say is that for you as a medievalist, to kind of keep your antenna up for places where medievalists are more sophisticated on environment perhaps than environmental historians have yet realized, and to think about the places where insights from environmental history might be useful to medievalists, but also to be thinking about places where insights from medieval history might be useful to environmental historians. And then the last thing I'll say is just your point about animal studies. Like, that's a huge growing arena in environmental history right now. That's one of the places where there's a lot of really fascinating work being done. So that's happening. I think the interest in animals generally is crossing fields.
We are going into our last 10 minutes of our time for the workshop. So I thought I would throw out one of the questions that the Environmental Working Group has kind of talked about as our final question. And I know that it's probably going to generate a lot of discussion. So I'm going to try to be quick, but I'm also going to ask you to be mindful of time when you make your contributions and your responses. And I think the answer to this is of course, but is the University of Kentucky posed to make contributions to this field on fire? And I will open this up to anybody in the audience who wants to, not just to the panelists, but to anybody who wants to. Emma, you're shaking. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'll just say it would be interesting for UK, and maybe this is already in the works, to think about what was here before the campus. Who was here, what was happening, and then ways to acknowledge that, reparative justice. So that's what comes up for me as we're studying even if we're studying someplace, another place while we're here, I feel like environmental history just always has this component of social justice that's inherent to the study of the environment. But I think that UK could play a role in trying to see what it did or didn't do in terms of displacement in Lexington.
Okay, Dr. Vivian?
So I'm listening from my phone today, so you can't see me, but I've really been enjoying this discussion and all the great points. And so thank you for this. It seems to me that Dr. Newfont's point that was made at the outset, and I forget the exact phrasing, but she had a wonderful statement about the knitting together of race, public history, and environmental history, really does position the university as having an opportunity to make a real strong impact and to lead in this field or these fields, the kind of nexus of activity we've been talking about. And that also strikes me as important. Not only do we have, obviously, graduate students working in this area and faculty that are very committed to research in this, again, nexus of activity, but, you know, one reason why I think these fields are very important right now and have real potential to reach audiences both within and without the academy is recognition of how deeply entwined human life is with the environment and how closely tied those questions are to, you know, questions about race, social order, and, you know, who gets what and who is where. And so my hope is that that's a real opportunity for the field as a whole. I think it's an opportunity for historians to be doing work that is both aimed at other scholars, but also has a public dimension to it, and hopefully helps communities navigate some of the real challenges that we're thinking about now, reckoning about with now. And, you know, I hope it leads to action and organization that helps us deal with climate change, deal with racial inequality, deal with environmental justice of the kind that's been mentioned on a number of occasions here. So I'm very excited by what I've heard today, and just want to sort of applaud the workshop and the work that's being discussed, but say I really do think there's an opportunity for the university and the department to set direction here.
Did you were shaking your head a while ago. Did you want to add something or make a contribution?
I don't really have anything particular, but I was just shaking my
okay.
Yes, we do. I was also anxious to hear about what other folks who are participating here outside our discussions, what they had to say too. So sorry, nothing very concrete.
Well, I think on that note, since we're down to our last 5 minutes, Dr. Newfont, did you want to offer any closing comments or anything, since you are our faculty advisor or anything like that?
My closing comments would just be to thank this group of graduate students for pulling this together. This is the first history workshop that's been really grad student driven. And so I really appreciate that. And I want to draw the department's attention that I didn't mention in my opening remarks that the other thing about environmental history is that its practitioners are a good deal younger than historians across the board. And I'm beginning to be, as Amy said, like one of the senior environmental historians. But it's really exciting to me how much good work is coming out of the University of Kentucky, and these, and this, I think we are producing some of the important scholars in the field. Jillian's already published a really important piece on Black ecologies that is getting wide readership, and I think is really important that direction. And as we move some of these other projects to the publication stage, I think Cameron's got some stuff on Civil War and weather too that is doing also, you know, getting some attention, although he's a very early career scholar. So that's that's wonderful to see. And I think there's a lot more where that came from, that the UK scholars are going to be producing some of this cutting edge scholarship. And I think our department has the opportunity to figure out how to be a leader at this nexus that Dr. Vivian was talking about.
If there are no other comments, I am going to close. But before I do that, I'm just going to give anybody a last chance if they want to say anything else. Okay.
Thank you for organizing this. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay. Well, we thank you all for coming, both from the programming committee and from the environmental history working group. We thank you all. The next workshop will be next Friday at 2 p.m. Like Dr. Makra said at the beginning, it will focus on Dr. Scott Taylor's work, which will be circulated, I'm assuming, next Monday. And we thank you again for joining us, and we hope you can join us next Friday.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention, also pointing to the what the exciting work that we have done by grad students, that next semester, in addition to Alan Fletcher's paper that will be in 2 weeks from today, next semester we're also going to have a grad student work in progress panel. And so hopefully some of you will be able to share your work on that panel, and I can't wait to hear more.